The boy had gone days without a proper meal, yet the very first thing he did when he saw the elderly man struggling with two heavy grocery bags at the street corner was to step forward and offer, "Let me carry that for you, sir." No one around them paused. No one turned to look. In a bustling city neighborhood like this, a small act of kindness between a young black boy and a white-haired stranger was the kind of moment people deliberately walked past, much like passing a stray animal they couldn't help. But this boy, Isaiah Brooks, with his thin frame and sharp elbows showing through worn sleeves, had no idea that the man in the long gray coat was wealthier than the combined value of every home, car, and shop on that entire block. He only saw that the man was weary. He only saw that one of the bags was on the verge of tearing. He only knew that offering help, even when you had nothing yourself, was the one lesson his mother had instilled in him before she passed away, the one thing she said he should never stop doing. That simple choice, made in the chilly light on a quiet street corner outside a small grocery, would set in motion a story that would touch hearts far beyond that moment. Before we dive in, I'd love for you to share in the comments where you're watching from today, and if stories of quiet kindness like this one move you, please hit subscribe so you never miss the next. The neighborhood had a way of looking gray and heavy, even on days when the sun tried to break through. That gray seemed to seep into the old brick buildings, the sagging chain-link fences, and the tired faces of people waiting at bus stops with hands buried deep in thin coats. A sharp wind swept in from the nearby lake, cutting through every layer of clothing. It rattled loose street signs and sent empty plastic bags tumbling down the gutters in slow, aimless rolls. It found every gap in jackets and coats, a constant reminder that winter had settled in to stay. On a corner not far from the water, a small family-owned grocery store had been serving the community for many years. The door chimed softly with an old electronic bell each time someone entered or left, and with every opening, a cold gust followed the customer inside. Isaiah Brooks stood across the street, his hands tucked into the sleeves of a jacket that had seen many owners before him. His sneakers were too large, stuffed with folded newspaper at the toes to keep them from slipping off when he ran. He watched the store door, waiting for the right moment, though he wasn't entirely sure what that moment would look like. He wasn't planning to take anything. His mother, before illness took her, had taught him that stealing was a door that, once opened, could never be fully closed again. He was simply hoping that someone might drop a coin, or set a bag down for too long, or leave behind a piece of bread on the bench outside. Hope, he had learned, was something to hold gently, like a delicate moth. Squeeze too tightly, and it would crumble in your hands. He had been on his own for weeks now. After his mother passed, his grandmother had taken him in, but following a fall, she had been moved to a care facility. A social worker had spoken of a placement, a foster home, some kind of plan, but the days stretched on with no one coming. So Isaiah had stopped staying at the apartment. He was afraid that if he remained in one place too long, someone in authority would arrive and take him somewhere unfamiliar. He had heard troubling stories from older kids about such places, stories that made the cold sidewalk feel safer by comparison. He carried his life in a backpack with one broken strap. Inside were a notebook, a stub of pencil, a small photograph of his mother holding him as a baby, and a single peppermint candy he was saving. For a moment he couldn't yet imagine. He was waiting, in his quiet way, to be seen. The man who finally stepped out of the grocery that afternoon did not look like someone who needed help. He appeared to be a man who had lived long enough to handle his own burdens. Tall, with a slight stoop, he had a head of neatly cut silver hair and wore a long charcoal gray wool coat that was clearly well made and cared for over many years, the kind purchased once long ago by someone who saw no need to replace it often. He wore plain brown leather gloves and a scarf the color of dry autumn leaves. In his right hand was a cane of dark wood with a warm brass handle, and in the crook of his left arm were two paper grocery bags. the kind the store still used. The bags were full, almost too full. The bottom of the outer one was already darkening with a damp spot from something leaking inside, and the paper near the handle was beginning to weaken and tear. His name was Arthur Langford, and he was an elderly gentleman who had walked into countless small stores in countless neighborhoods over the decades, quietly without fanfare, paying in cash for what he needed. The young woman at the register hadn't recognized him. She had only offered a polite smile, counted his change, and wished him a good evening. That was precisely how Arthur preferred it. He hadn't driven himself there that day. His car and driver were waiting several blocks away near the lake. Arthur had a habit, one his late wife used to gently tease him about, of asking to be dropped off some distance from his actual destination. He liked to walk, he liked to observe. He liked to be reminded that the world was made of streets, storefronts, and small daily acts, not just boardrooms, meetings, and business reports. Isaiah noticed the bag beginning to tear before Arthur did. He saw the soft paper starting to split along the seam at the bottom. Just a small tear at first, like ice beginning to crack on a pond. He saw the old man shift his weight, plant his cane, and adjust his grip. And in that small, careful motion, Isaiah saw something that had nothing to do with wealth or fine coats or canes. He saw a person who was tired. He saw a person who would likely drop the bag in just a few more steps and then stand there on the sidewalk, feeling exposed in front of people who wouldn't stop to help. Isaiah didn't overthink it. He crossed the street. "Sir," he said, stepping up beside Arthur with both hands already half raised, careful the way one approaches a cat. They don't want to startle. "Sir, your bag. It looks like it's about to tear. Let me carry that for you." Arthur turned his head. His eyes were a clear, watery blue, like a sky that had been washed clean too many times, and it took a moment for them to focus on the small face, looking up from near his elbow. He blinked and glanced down at the bag. The split had widened, and a single orange was now pressing against the paper, ready to tumble into the street. Arthur made a small sound, almost a chuckle, the kind an old man makes when caught between embarrassment and gratitude, unsure which to lean into. "Well," he said, his voice low and dry like the turning of a page, "I suppose you're right about that." Isaiah very gently reached up and slid both of his thin arms under the bottom of the failing bag. The paper rustled, and the orange shifted, but stayed in place. He lifted it, feeling the weight of the groceries press against his chest. For a moment he was reminded of how little he had eaten, how the hunger sat quietly in his ribs. But he kept his expression steady. He had practiced that. He took the whole bag carefully into his arms, leaving Arthur with only the second, lighter one that wasn't about to give way. "Thank you, young man," Arthur said. He looked properly at the boy for the first time. The thin jacket, the oversized sneakers, the careful eyes. He said nothing about what he saw. "Where are you headed, sir?" Isaiah asked, adjusting the bag so the bottom wouldn't tear further. He kept his voice polite, the way his mother had taught him, with "sir" at the end, like a small respectful bow. "I can walk with you, just to make sure it doesn't fall." Arthur considered the boy for a long moment. There was a stillness to him that some people had mistaken for coldness over the years. But it wasn't coldness. It was the stillness of a man who had learned, through pain and time, to look at things twice before deciding what they were. He had seen too many people rush to judgments and miss the truth right in front of them. So he stood there on the sidewalk, his cane planted firmly on the cracked concrete, and he looked at the boy's face, at his hands red from the cold, at the careful, almost formal way he held the broken bag, as if entrusted with something fragile and important that he was determined on to fail. "I'm parked about 6 blocks from here near the lake," Arthur said slowly. "It's a long walk for someone small carrying a heavy bag." "I don't mind, sir," Isaiah said. And he didn't. His legs were tired, his stomach hollow, but there was something steadying about being asked to do something, about having a purpose for his small body. The sidewalk had been a place of waiting all afternoon. Now, suddenly it was a place of moving forward. "All right then," Arthur said. He shifted the second bag higher into the crook of his arm and tapped his cane once on the ground, like marking the beginning of a journey. "Let's walk." They walked. The wind from the lake pushed against them in long, cold gusts that made Isaiah tuck his chin into his jacket collar and made Arthur's coat flap softly around his knees. They didn't speak much at first. Arthur had never been one to fill silence, just to fill it, and Isaiah was focused on the bag, keeping his arm steady, making sure the orange didn't escape. They passed a closed barber shop with a hand-painted sign in the window. They passed a laundromat where warm yellow light spilled onto the sidewalk and the air smelled of soap and fresh laundry. They passed a man sitting on a milk crate outside a corner store who nodded once at Arthur and once at Isaiah, as if he had seen them walking together every day. After a few blocks, Arthur spoke. "What's your name, young man?" "Isaiah, sir, Isaiah Brooks." "Isaiah." Arthur rolled the name slowly, as if tasting something he hadn't had in a long time. "That's a strong name, a meaningful one." "My mother chose it," Isaiah said. His voice didn't change much, but Arthur, who had spent a lifetime listening to the things people didn't quite say, heard the small dip in it, the careful way the boy used the past tense. "She chose well," Arthur said. He let the silence sit for a few more steps, then asked gently, "And what does your mother do, Isaiah?" Isaiah's arms tightened a little around the bag. He looked straight ahead at the sidewalk cracks and said, "She passed away, sir, some time ago now." Arthur didn't offer the quick, hollow, "I'm sorry" that most people did, the kind that closed a door rather than opening one. He simply nodded slowly and said, "Then she is still choosing your name every time you say it." And Isaiah, who hadn't cried in front of anyone in a long time because crying in front of people was a luxury he couldn't afford, felt something hot stir behind his eyes. He pressed his lips together hard and held it in. They kept walking. The cane tapped a slow, even rhythm on the concrete. The wind pushed and pulled at them. Somewhere in the distance, a freight train sounded a long, low note that seemed to belong to the gray sky itself. And Isaiah, carrying a stranger's groceries through a neighborhood that had taught him to expect little, felt for the first time in weeks that he wasn't entirely alone. Arthur didn't ask about the father. He didn't ask where Isaiah lived, or who was waiting for him at home, or why a young boy was standing outside a grocery store in the afternoon when other children his age were in warm classrooms or at kitchen tables. He had learned over a long life of meeting people in difficult circumstances that questions could feel like accusations if they came too quickly, and that the most important things a person needed to share would come in their own time if you let them. So he walked and listened to the soft scrape of the boy's oversized sneakers on the sidewalk, and he made a small, quiet calculation in his mind, the kind he had made in boardrooms and on factory floors and in hospital waiting rooms for decades. The calculation was this: the boy was hungry, the boy was alone. The boy was carrying a stranger's groceries simply because the bag was about to break, and he had nothing to gain from it that he could name. "Isaiah," Arthur said after another stretch, "do you live near here?" "Sort of, sir," Isaiah said. He chose the words carefully. "Sort of" was a phrase he had learned to use for many things lately. It meant, "Not really, but please don't ask me to explain." "A few streets over. And is anyone expecting you for supper?" The question was so gentle that Isaiah almost didn't feel its edge. He looked up at Arthur, at the long gray coat, the silver hair, the patient blue eyes, and he understood, in the way a small animal senses safety before it has words for it, that the old man already knew the answer. He didn't know how, he just knew. "No, sir," Isaiah said, "not really." Arthur nodded once. He didn't stop walking. He didn't change the rhythm of his cane. He simply absorbed the answer, the way the ground absorbs rain, and kept moving. They turned onto a wider street where the buildings began to thin, and the cold smell of the lake grew stronger. That particular scent of water and wet stone that anyone who has lived near it carries forever. 2 blocks ahead, in a small gravel parking lot beside a closed shop, Isaiah could see a long, dark car waiting. The kind of car he had only ever seen in movies or parked outside important buildings downtown. A man in a dark suit and a wool driver's cap stood beside it, hands clasped in front of him, watching the street the way someone watches a door they're responsible for. Isaiah's steps slowed, without him meaning to. He hadn't expected the car. He hadn't expected the driver. He had assumed somewhere in the back of his mind that the old man would walk all the way home. That home was a small place with a kettle on the stove and a chair by the window. The dark car didn't fit that picture. It belonged to a different kind of story. Arthur felt the boy hesitate beside him. "That's just Raymond," he said quietly, almost apologetically. "He drives me. He's been with me for many years. He's a good man. He won't bother you." "Yes, sir," Isaiah said, but his arms had tightened around the bag again, and his eyes had grown watchful. He had survived weeks on the street by paying attention to which situations were safe and which weren't. And a strange car with a strange man beside it wasn't usually something that ended well for a boy in the parts of the city he knew. Raymond, the driver, saw them coming from a distance. He straightened but didn't move toward them. He had been told many times by Mr. Langford not to rush, not to crowd, not to make a scene. He had a kind, square face and a small graying mustache, and when he saw his employer walking with a child carrying a torn grocery bag, his expression didn't change in any obvious way, but his eyes softened at the corners. He had worked for Arthur long enough to know that the old man rarely returned to the car alone, and almost never without a small story attached. "Raymond," Arthur said as they reached the gravel lot. "This is Isaiah Brooks. He's been kind enough to keep my groceries from rolling into the street." Raymond tipped his cap. "Mr. Brooks," he said with complete seriousness, "thank you for your help." Isaiah didn't know what to do with being called Mr. Brooks. No one had ever called him that. Teachers had called him Isaiah. His mother had called him My Heart sometimes, and older kids on the block had called him things he tried not to repeat, even in his own thoughts. Mr. Brooks was a name for a grown man in a suit, a name that suggested he was someone worth addressing properly, and it landed in his chest with a strange, warm weight. He nodded carefully to Raymond and said, "Yes, sir," because it was the only response that felt right. Raymond stepped forward and reached for the torn bag, and for half a second, Isaiah didn't want to give it up. The bag had been his job, his reason for walking, the small important thing he had been entrusted with, and handing it over felt like the end of something. But Raymond's hands were patient and his eyes were kind, and Isaiah let the bag slide gently into the driver's arms. The orange, which had been threatening to escape for blocks, was finally safe. "Thank you, Isaiah," Arthur said. He reached into the inside pocket of his long gray coat, and Isaiah saw the movement and felt his stomach tighten. He knew what came next. He had imagined it the entire walk, had almost allowed himself to hope for it. And now that the moment had arrived, he found, to his own surprise, that he didn't want it. He didn't want this old man who had spoken to him kindly and honored his mother's choice of name to reach into a pocket and hand him a folded bill, turning the whole afternoon into a transaction. He took a small step back. "I didn't do it for money, sir," he said. His voice was quiet but very clear. "I did it because the bag was about to break." Arthur's hand paused inside his coat. He looked at the boy for a long moment, and something moved across his face that wasn't quite a smile, but was close. The way the first light before dawn isn't quite sunrise, but tells you it's coming. He withdrew his hand from the coat. It was empty. "I know you didn't," Arthur said. "I was reaching for something else." He produced instead a small white business card. printed on heavy paper, that bent but didn't fold easily. He held it out between two gloved fingers. "This has my name and a telephone number. The number rings to a woman named Dorothy who has worked for me for many years. If you ever find yourself in a difficult situation, Isaiah, and you need someone to call, you may call that number. You don't have to explain anything. You only have to say, 'This is Isaiah, and I met Mr. Langford outside the grocery store.' Dorothy will know what to do." Isaiah took the card. His fingers were cold and clumsy, and the paper felt impossibly smooth between them. He looked down at it. Printed in plain black letters, no logo, no fancy lettering, was the name, Arthur J. Langford. Below it, a phone number, nothing else. No title, no company, no address. He turned it over. The back was blank. He didn't know, holding that card in his red-knuckled hand on a gravel lot on a cold afternoon, that the name Arthur J. Langford had appeared on the front of business magazines and in the financial pages of major newspapers for decades. He didn't know that the company Arthur had founded years ago, in a small garage, a small manufacturing business making specialized parts for industrial machinery, had grown into one of the largest privately held companies in the region, with factories in multiple states and offices in other countries. He didn't know that Arthur Langford had been featured on the cover of major business publications and had quietly declined further invitations because he didn't like having his picture taken. He didn't know that the man standing before him in the long gray coat could have bought the entire block and every building on it with what he kept in a single account. He only knew that the old man had given him a card with a name and a number and had told him he could call. "Thank you, sir," Isaiah said. He slipped the card very carefully into the inside pocket of his too-big jacket, the pocket closest to his heart, the same one where he kept the photograph of his mother. Arthur and Raymond exchanged a look over the boy's head that lasted no more than a second. It was a look that had passed between them many times before in many different parking lots over the years of driving together. Raymond gave the smallest nod, the kind a man gives when he has already understood the question before it's asked. He turned and opened the rear door of the long, dark car, and warm air spilled out onto the gravel, carrying the soft scent of leather and clean wool. "Isaiah," Arthur said, "before we say goodbye, I'd like to ask you something, and I want you to feel free to say no. I'm going to have supper in about an hour at a small restaurant not far from here. The owner is a friend of mine. The food is simple and very good. I would be glad of the company if you would join me." He paused. He didn't lean down. He didn't soften his voice into the patronizing tone adults sometimes used with children when trying to be kind. He spoke to Isaiah the way he would have spoken to any guest. "You are not obligated. Raymond can take you wherever you need to go, with no supper at all if that's what you prefer. I only wanted to ask." Isaiah stood very still in the gravel lot. The wind off the lake pushed at the back of his neck, and his stomach, which had been quiet for hours by sheer force of will, gave a small, treacherous turn at the word supper. He thought about the peppermint candy in his backpack, the one he had been saving for a moment he couldn't imagine. He thought about his mother, who had taught him to be careful with strangers, and who had also taught him that some strangers were not strangers at all, but neighbors he simply hadn't met yet. He looked up at Arthur's face, at the patient blue eyes, the silver hair, the brown leather gloves folded calmly around the brass handle of the cane. He looked at Raymond, who had stepped back a respectful distance and was pretending to inspect something on the car door. "Yes, sir," Isaiah said. His voice was small but steady. "I would like that. Thank you, sir." Arthur nodded once, as if a small but important agreement had been settled, and gestured toward the open door of the car. Isaiah hesitated at the threshold the way a person hesitates at the edge of deep water, and then he climbed in. The seat was wider than his grandmother's couch. The leather was warm. There was a soft hum somewhere under the floor that he realized after a moment was a heater, running quietly to keep the inside comfortable. He had never been inside a car like this. He sat very still, his backpack on his lap, and tried not to touch anything he didn't need to touch. Arthur settled in beside him with the slow, careful movements of a man whose joints no longer forgave easily. Raymond closed the door, walked around to the front, and slid into the driver's seat. The car pulled out of the gravel lot and turned onto the wide street that ran along the lake, and Isaiah watched through the window as the neighborhood slid past him in a way it never had before. From inside a car, everything looked smaller. The broken sidewalks didn't bite at his oversized sneakers. The wind couldn't reach him. "Raymond," Arthur said, "the place on Larchmere, please. Tell Elena we'll be two for supper, and that one of us is a young man with a very honest face." "Yes, sir," Raymond said. He glanced once into the rearview mirror, met Isaiah's eyes, and gave him a small, reassuring smile that needed no words. The drive took some time. They left the gray streets near the lake and moved through neighborhoods Isaiah had only ever seen from city buses. He watched the houses grow larger, the trees thicker, the sidewalks cleaner. He didn't say anything. Arthur didn't push him to say anything. The old man sat with his cane resting between his knees and his gloved hands folded over the brass handle, looking out his own window, with the quiet expression of someone who had seen these same streets countless times and still found something in them worth noticing. Larchmere was a long, tree-lined street of small shops and old brick buildings. The restaurant Arthur had spoken of was tucked between an antique bookstore and a tailor's shop. Its name, painted in modest gold letters on the front window, was Elena's. The restaurant was small and warm and smelled of bread. That was the first thing Isaiah noticed when Raymond held the door open for him, and the bell above the door gave a soft, friendly chime. The smell of bread, the kind that has been baking slowly for hours, wrapped itself around him the moment he stepped inside, making his shoulders drop from around his ears without his permission. There were only about a dozen tables in the whole room, each covered with a plain white cloth and set with simple white plates and heavy silverware that looked polished by hand. The walls were painted a soft yellow, like butter left out on a counter, and old framed photographs hung in mismatched frames. A younger woman in a kitchen, a man in an apron holding up a fish, two children on a beach somewhere far from here. A woman in her later years came out from a swinging door at the back, wiping her hands on a clean white towel. She was short and round, with her gray hair pulled back into a low bun. When she saw Arthur standing inside the door, she made a small sound of pleasure from deep in her chest and crossed the room with her arms already opening. "Arthur," she said, taking both of his hands in hers. "It's been weeks, Arthur." "I know, Elena, forgive me. The doctors have been keeping me on a short leash lately." "The doctors should mind their own business," Elena said firmly, but she was smiling. Then she turned and looked down at Isaiah, who was standing half a step behind Arthur, with his backpack clutched in front of him, like a small shield. Elena's face didn't change in any sudden way. She didn't gasp or make a fuss the way some adults did when they noticed a child who looked the way Isaiah looked. She simply lowered herself slowly until her face was level with his and said with the same warm directness she had used with Arthur, "And you must be the young man with the honest face. I am Elena. This is my restaurant. You are very welcome here." "Thank you, ma'am," Isaiah said. "I am Isaiah. Isaiah." She repeated it the way Arthur had, slowly, as if the name deserved its proper weight. "A beautiful name. Are you hungry, Isaiah?" He hesitated. He had been taught not to admit to hunger in front of people who didn't know him, because hunger, admitted out loud, was something that made adults uncomfortable, and uncomfortable adults made bad decisions. But Elena's face was patient. Arthur was standing quietly behind him, and the smell of the bread was so strong and so good that he could feel it in his throat. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "I think I am." "Good," Elena said, and stood. "Then we've already done the most important part." She led them to a table near the front window, where the late afternoon light came in soft and golden through the glass, and she pulled out a chair for Isaiah, with the same formal courtesy she would have shown anyone. He sat. The chair was solid and warm. Elena disappeared back through the swinging door, and a moment later, a young woman in a long apron brought a basket of bread to the table, still warm from the oven, with a small dish of butter and another of olive oil. Arthur settled himself across from Isaiah with a quiet sigh. He set his cane against the side of the table where it wouldn't fall. He took off his gloves and folded them neatly. Then he reached for the bread basket, tore a piece for himself slowly, and pushed the basket gently toward the middle of the table where Isaiah could reach it. "Eat as much as you like," Arthur said. "Elena will keep bringing it as long as we keep eating it. That's how she is." Isaiah reached for a piece of bread. His hand was shaking just slightly, the way hands shake when a body has been waiting too long for something, and finally allows itself to believe the thing is real. He tore the bread carefully, the way he would have torn a page he didn't want to damage. He dipped a small corner of it in the olive oil. He put it in his mouth. The bread tasted like a memory he didn't know he had. He chewed slowly. He didn't cry. He had decided somewhere on the drive over that he wasn't going to cry in front of Arthur, but his eyes stung, and he kept them down on the white tablecloth as he ate. Arthur didn't watch him eat. That was the kindness Isaiah noticed first, and the one he would remember for the rest of his life. Arthur didn't lean forward in his chair, didn't study the boy's face, didn't say any of the soft, pitying things adults sometimes said when they saw a hungry child eating. Arthur simply tore his own piece of bread, dipped it in his own oil, and turned his face slightly toward the window so that Isaiah could eat in peace. He spoke now and then about small, easy things. The weather, the way the trees on the street had lost their leaves later than usual, a baseball game from the summer before that Raymond had taken him to. He spoke the way a person speaks, to fill a room with a gentle, undemanding sound, the way you leave a radio on for someone recovering from something difficult. Elena brought soup. She brought a plate of roasted chicken with potatoes and green beans cooked in butter. She brought a small glass of milk for Isaiah and a cup of black coffee for Arthur, and refilled the bread basket twice without being asked. She didn't ask Isaiah any questions. She didn't ask Arthur any questions either. She simply moved through the small, warm room like someone who had decided long ago that the people at her tables were her people, and her job was to feed them and let them be. Halfway through the chicken, Isaiah set his fork down. He had eaten more in the last little while than he had eaten in days combined, and his stomach, which had grown used to being empty, was protesting the sudden fullness in small, uncertain ways. He folded his hands in his lap. He looked at the plate. He looked at Arthur. "Sir," he said, "may I ask you something?" "You may ask me anything," Arthur said. Isaiah took a small breath. "Why are you doing this?" Arthur didn't answer right away. He set his own fork down. He picked up his coffee, took a slow sip, and set the cup back into its saucer, with the careful precision of a man who had spent a long life around fragile things. He looked at Isaiah across the white tablecloth, and the light through the window caught the silver of his hair and made it look for a moment almost golden. "That's a good question," Arthur said. "It deserves an honest answer." He paused. "When I was about your age, Isaiah, I lived in a small town in western Pennsylvania that doesn't exist anymore. The mill closed, and then the town closed, the way towns do when the work disappears. My father had been gone for a long time by then, and my mother was a seamstress who took in mending for the families who still had a little money. We didn't have much. There were days, more than I like to remember, when I went to school hungry, and there were days when I came home from school even hungrier, because my mother had given me the only piece of bread in the house for my lunch and had eaten nothing herself." He stopped. He took another sip of coffee. Isaiah didn't move. "One afternoon," Arthur went on, "I was walking home from school in the cold, and I passed a small grocery on the corner of our street, and I saw an old woman drop a sack of apples on the sidewalk outside. The sack had split. The apples rolled everywhere. She was bent over trying to pick them up, and she couldn't quite manage it, because her back wasn't what it used to be. I was young. I was hungry enough that the smell of those apples on the cold sidewalk almost made me dizzy, and I had a choice, the same kind of choice you had this afternoon outside the grocery store. I could have picked up one of those apples and put it in my pocket and walked away, and she would never have known. No one in the world would have blamed me if they had known. He looked at Isaiah very steadily. I didn't do that, Arthur said. I picked up every one of those apples, put them back in her arms, and walked her to her door. And when we got to her door, she invited me in and gave me a bowl of stew that I can still taste if I close my eyes. He paused. Her name was Mrs. Ellison. She fed me supper twice a week for years afterward. She is the reason I am sitting here tonight. Isaiah was very still. You did for me today, Arthur said quietly, what I did for her a long time ago. So I am doing for you what she did for me. Isaiah looked down at the white tablecloth for a long time. The story had landed in him in a place that didn't yet have words for what it was feeling. He thought about the apples rolling on a cold sidewalk long ago. He thought about a small boy with empty pockets choosing to give back what no one would have known he had taken. He thought about Mrs. Ellison, whoever she had been, who had opened her door to a hungry child and changed the shape of a life she could not possibly have foreseen. He thought about his own mother, who had said to him once, sitting on the edge of his bed, when he was young and feverish and couldn't sleep, "The only way the world gets better, baby, is when people decide to be the better part of it." He hadn't understood her then. He thought he might be beginning to understand her now. "Sir," he said, and his voice was very small, "I don't know how to say thank you for this." "You don't have to," Arthur said. "You already did outside the store." They finished their meal slowly. Elena brought a small dish of vanilla ice cream for Isaiah without asking, and Arthur didn't protest. The light through the window deepened from gold into the soft blue that comes just before evening, and the other tables in the restaurant began to fill with quiet people in coats, neighbors and regulars who nodded to Elena and to Arthur as they passed. Isaiah ate the ice cream one careful spoonful at a time, making it last, the way he had learned to make small good things last. When the meal was over, Arthur settled the bill with Elena in a way Isaiah didn't see, because Arthur had a particular skill for handling money, in a manner that didn't make anyone feel like a charity case. Elena walked them to the door. She bent down to Isaiah's height again and said, "You come back any time, Isaiah, with Arthur or without. You tell whoever is at the door that Elena is expecting you, and there will always be a plate." "Yes, ma'am," Isaiah said. "Thank you, ma'am." Outside, the air had grown colder, but it didn't bite the way it had earlier. Raymond was waiting beside the car with the same calm patience he had shown in the gravel lot, and he opened the rear door without a word. Arthur paused on the sidewalk before getting in. He turned to Isaiah. "I'm going to ask you one more thing tonight, Isaiah, and again you are free to say no." He looked at the boy carefully. "Raymond and I are going to drive back across the city now. The house I live in has more rooms than any one old man needs. There is a small guest room on the first floor with a bed that has clean sheets and a bathroom of its own, and a door that locks from the inside. There's a woman named Dorothy, the one whose number is on the card I gave you, who lives in a cottage on the property and looks after the house. She is a grandmother, many times over, and she is kinder than I am, which is saying something. I would like to offer you that room for tonight, for as many nights as you need, while we figure out together what comes next. You would not be a guest who has to earn his keep. You would be a young man under my roof, and you would be safe there." He paused. "You may say no, Isaiah. Raymond will take you anywhere you ask him to take you. I will not be hurt, and I will not be offended. But I am an old man, and I have learned that some offers, when they come, should be made plainly. So I am making it plainly." Isaiah stood on the sidewalk outside Elena's restaurant in his too big jacket and too big sneakers and looked up at the old man in the long gray coat. He thought about the card in his pocket and the photograph of his mother in the same pocket, and the bed with clean sheets he hadn't slept in for weeks, and the door that locked from the inside. He thought about his grandmother in the care facility, whom he hadn't been allowed to see, and the social worker who had never come. He thought about the cold of the sidewalk and the long, hungry nights and the small, careful hope He had been trying not to crush in his hand all afternoon. "Yes, sir," he said. "Thank you, sir. I would like that." The drive back across the city took longer than the drive to the restaurant, because Arthur's house was not in the city at all. It was east of it, past the suburbs Isaiah had only ever seen on highway signs, on a quiet road lined with old trees that had been standing there long before any of them were born. Isaiah watched the streetlights give way to porch lights, and the porch lights give way to long stretches of dark countryside, where the only light was the moon on the bare fields. He didn't say anything for most of the drive. Arthur didn't push him to. Raymond drove with the same steady patience he had shown all evening, and once, when Isaiah's eyes began to grow heavy in the warm leather seat, Raymond adjusted the heater a small degree higher without being asked. The house, when they reached it, was not the kind of house Isaiah had imagined a wealthy man would live in. It was a long, low farmhouse made of pale stone, with a slate roof and warm yellow light coming from the windows on the lower floor. There was a wreath on the door made of dried wheat and a single red ribbon. Dorothy was already waiting in the front hall when they came inside, and she was exactly as Arthur had described her. A small woman with iron-gray hair and a face that had been kind for so long that the kindness had settled into the lines of it permanently. She didn't make a fuss over Isaiah. She simply said, "Welcome, young man. The guest room is made up. Are you tired?" And Isaiah, who hadn't realized until that moment how tired he was, nodded. That was the beginning. The story didn't end that night, because real stories rarely do. It continued through the seasons. Arthur's lawyers quietly and carefully helped Isaiah's grandmother get the medical care she needed, and helped Isaiah become her legal ward, with Arthur and Dorothy named as guardians in the event she could not return. Isaiah went back to school, a different school where he was allowed to be quiet and was not asked questions he couldn't answer. He kept the small white business card in the inside pocket of a new jacket that fit him properly, and he kept the photograph of his mother in the same pocket, and he kept the peppermint candy too, because he had decided that the moment he had been saving it for was the moment he no longer needed to save it. The story of how they met never became something shared widely online. There were no security cameras on that street corner that afternoon, and no one in the city had any idea that one of the wealthiest men in the region had bought groceries at a family-run store and let a hungry child carry his bag. The story stayed where it began, between the two of them, the way the most important stories often do. Arthur didn't write about it. Isaiah didn't tell anyone at his new school. Only Raymond and Elena and Dorothy knew, and they were the kind of people who knew how to keep something that wasn't theirs to tell. Years passed. Arthur lived longer than his doctors had expected, the way stubborn men sometimes do when they have found a reason to stay. He saw Isaiah graduate from high school. He saw him accepted into a university on a scholarship that Arthur had arranged without ever letting Isaiah know it had been arranged. He didn't see him graduate from college because he passed away quietly in his sleep in the small stone farmhouse not long before, with Dorothy holding his hand and Isaiah sitting in the chair beside the bed, reading aloud from a book Arthur had given him years earlier. In Arthur's will there was a letter for Isaiah. It was short. It said, "I want you to remember 3 things. The first is that your mother chose your name. The second is that you carried my groceries when no one else would. The third is that the world gets better only when people decide to be the better part of it. And you, Isaiah Brooks, were the better part of mine." Isaiah is a grown man now. He runs a foundation in the city that finds children who are sleeping where they should not be sleeping and offers them a door that locks from the inside and a bed with clean sheets. He named the foundation after a woman in Pennsylvania he never met. He calls it Ellison House. If this story touched your heart, leave a comment telling me what part stayed with you, and subscribe for more stories of quiet kindness and second chances. Thank you for being here.